here because I think maybe I can explain my theory best by giving you a few little drawings, and I can draw fairly well, so this might work. I have one theory which I call the Mossad box theory. See this box, this pretty box right here? That's the Mossad connection to the JFK conspiracy. My box, you can easily fit the CIA did it theory in there. You can put the theory that the Mafia did it. You can put the French connection in there. And believe it or not, you can even put the right-wingers in there. And I'll explain that in a minute because that's a very interesting story. All of these things taken together can be put together and put in this Mossad box. And they all fit in there very snugly and together, and they don't contradict one another. But the one thing that they all have in common which ties them together is the Israeli connection. Now, I know everybody here is worried about the right-wing connection to the Kennedy assassination. You're thinking, I wonder if I know anybody who was involved. Well, now, everybody saw Ed Asner play Guy Bannister. Well, now, every time I read about Guy Bannister being, when these liberals write these books about the JFK assassination, they say, aha! It had to be a right-wing conspiracy because Guy Bannister was involved. And he probably was. Guy Bannister was former FBI. He was mixed up with the CIA. He was mixed up with everybody. He's mixed up with some right-wingers in New Orleans. I hate to mention this name, but you know who two of his good friends were in New Orleans? Husband and wife team. Kent and Phoebe Courtney. I think she's still alive. Well, I'll tell you this much about Kent and Phoebe Courtney. For years, a lot of people in what you might call the hard right, frankly, thought that Kent and Phoebe Courtney were tied up with the Anti-Defamation League. Because I do know this much, that even if they weren't on the payroll of the ADL, for years they did a lot of things to frustrate the work of people that the ADL didn't like. So, if Guy Bannister was a right-winger, he was a Kent and Phoebe Courtney kind of right-winger. He wasn't our kind of right-winger, so to speak. Guy Bannister also had another interesting contact in New Orleans, and this guy was a right-winger. Very, very anti-communist. And his name was B, that was his nickname, B. Botnick. You know who this right-winger was? He headed the ADL office in New Orleans. Now, poor old Steve Frog was quoted in the Los Angeles Times as saying he thought that the ADL was behind the Kennedy assassination. That isn't what Steve Frog said. What Steve Frog, in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, pointed out was that the New Orleans office of the ADL, which was headed by B. Botnick, that was his nickname, had one particular specialty at that time: spying on left-wing civil rights groups. And guess what? That's what Guy Bannister liked to do. And guess what? That's what Kent and Phoebe Courtney, Guy Bannister's good friends, like to do. And guess what? Spying on left-wing groups is what Lee Harvey Oswald was doing when he was running around in New Orleans, setting up his own left-wing group. So, is it a conspiracy theory? It's a theory. This, I admit, is a theory. It's speculation. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if when poor old Lee Harvey Oswald was running around down in New Orleans prior to the Kennedy assassination, he thought he was spying on left-wing groups for Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister had a detective agency that did contract work for B. Botnick of the ADL. Now, this is just a theory, mind you. But, bottom line of it is, if there were right-wingers like Guy Bannister and Kent and Phoebe Courtney, and I don't think they were involved in the conspiracy. I'm not even sure he was involved in the conspiracy either, but they were associated with Oswald. The bottom line of it is, if the right wing, quote-unquote, was involved in the JFK assassination, the right-wingers who were involved were hooked up to this group right here. So that's just a little detail that I know when it's published in detail in my book, the 4th edition of the book, there's going to be a lot of people who are very upset. And there are going to be these left-wingers who have been promoting this theory for the right wing, that the right wing was behind it, because the right-wingers are all connected with Israel. And that's very simple. That's kind of scary. That's one little model of this. Now let's get down to the real model, which really ties it all together, and it shows you how very simple my book is. A lot of people paint these conspiracies about the JFK assassination that are remarkably complex, and it's like you have all sorts of people tripping over one another, plotting to kill JFK. I don't think that was a big conspiracy at all. I keep saying this because I really think it's very simple and yet very profound. The people who were involved in the conspiracy, they weren't one big happy family, they were one small happy family. And as I document in the book, it really took only a handful of people to set the conspiracy in motion. Now let me show you this Clay-Shaw connection. I've kind of been going around it because those of you who are familiar with JFK know the basic theory that Jim Garrison presented. Clay-Shaw was a businessman. Let me refer to my notes here because I have a chart. This chart took me literally years to make because I worked, just because, it finally came to me one afternoon, and I'm glad it did because I think it really ties it all together. And it is in the new edition of the book, so you're getting a real good preview here. Here's Clay-Shaw, the New Orleans businessman who was indicted by Jim Garrison. Now, Shaw was connected with Guy Bannister, who I mentioned earlier, who in turn, of course, was connected with the ADL. There was also a gentleman named David Ferry. He was played by Joe Pesci in the movie. And, of course, you get down here to the lower level people. This chart, I'm not going to give you the whole thing because I don't want everybody to be confused. This is Lee Harvey Oswald. Here's those Cuban exiles we keep hearing about. Okay, then you have the Mafia. Everybody hears about the Mafia and Carlos Marcello. And you have the CIA. And of course the CIA, they were involved too, just as, and of course you can connect. Is anybody getting confused by this so far? You all able to follow along? I'll pass this chart out so you can see it in detail, but I want to explain it up here first. Here's the CIA. This is what this picture right here, I would call this the New Orleans nexus. This is the standard basic conspiracy theory on the JFK assassination. Well, you had some Mafia elements, you had some CIA elements, they were connected, and they were all connected to the Cubans, and Oswald was connected, and then there was Clay-Shaw who was connected to the CIA, and Bannister and Ferry and the Mafia. This is the part that they leave out. It's very simple, but this is why they have to leave it out. Clay-Shaw, Guy Bannister, and David Ferry were all jointly connected in their own fashion, but working together with a company based in Europe. I love this name. It's a great name. I wish I'd have thought of it myself. Called Permindex. Now, this company existed. This isn't a mythical company. Now, in the movie JFK, you see the character playing Jim Garrison confront Clay-Shaw and say, well, you served on the board of a CIA front company called Permindex, and Clay-Shaw says, oh, I'm going to sue. That's not true. Well, here's what Oliver Stone doesn't tell you about Permindex. The primary force behind Permindex was a guy named Tibor Rosenbaum. He headed the International Credit Bank of Geneva, Switzerland. The International Credit Bank of Geneva, Switzerland was the chief European money laundering operation for Meyer Lansky, which, of course, he was the real boss of the mob. We call it the Mafia because that's a good way to frame it on the Italian Americans. But Meyer Lansky ran organized crime. Meyer Lansky's buddy was typing.